This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today I'm excited to welcome Mr. Jonathan Klane to the show. Now, Mr. Klane is the senior safety editor for Lab Manager magazine, where he writes about risk, persuasion, data, adult learning, story science, and more. He is an experienced expert witness and a Ph.D. candidate in human and social dimensions of science and technology at Arizona State University. Mr. Klane, thank you so much for joining me here today at the Roundtable.
Thanks, Noah. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. And I'm really excited to chat more about, how to improve how you communicate with your client when you're an expert witness.
Absolutely. Well, let's just jump into it then. In addition to scientist, researcher, or expert witness, it seems to me that you are, above all else, as you said, a storyteller and an advocate for the use of creative telling in communication. How did you first get involved in expert witnessing, and what is that intersection between storytelling and expert witnessing?
Both great questions. Getting into expert witnessing was mostly from being a consultant. I was a traditional external consultant for 20 plus years. And, you sort of stumble into it. Someone sees you, hears about you, maybe attends a conference that you're speaking at, something like that. I can't even remember how the very first attorney found me, probably because I did some non-traditional expert witness stuff, meaning for attorneys that just needed help, and they talk with each other. So very often over the years, attorneys have come to me and said, "Hey, I got your name from fill in the blank so-and-so," or a third party like Roundtable, of course. You guys
Sure.
have been great. So that's kind of a very easy and not wonderful story. But getting into storytelling and where I am now is you're absolutely right, Noah. It's a huge part of my life. I'm an incredibly strong advocate. I'm biased towards it because, of course, it's what I do and I know the science behind it.
Sure.
So I study it in my PhD. I've done research on it. I've done talks on it. But the more interesting part is undoubtedly, John, how'd you get started in storytelling, right? How'd you figure this out? Well, I grew up in a family of salespeople. My dad was a traveling shoe salesman. So not like Al Bundy on Married with Children, working in a store, but he sold to stores. And I went on road trips with him and I saw him in action. And salespeople are great storytellers. And my dad was just a wonderful storyteller, just really great. So I grew up, I don't know if I got any of the storytelling genes. I actually think there are some. That's a whole nother deep level we could get into, but probably not a lot of help for people. And so my dad was a shoe salesman. My brother was a shoe salesman. My uncle was a shoe salesman. My grandma and grandma, what did she want me to call her? Grandmother and grandfather? I don't know. I'll say we're salespeople. I could call my grandmother a shoe salesman. And as long as I was buying a pair of shoes, she wouldn't care about being called a shoe salesman, right? So, and there's tons of stories there. I just see life as so many stories that I grew up in this family, but especially, as this saying goes, at my dad's knee, hearing stories, telling stories, and seeing the effects that storytelling had on people around my dad. Yes, customers, colleagues, friends, others, and of course with me. He told me stories galore while we were playing gin, cards or something like that, or while we were in the car driving to a sales call or something like that. It was just a wonder. Then I'm a consultant and I get my master's in adult learning, adult education. And I figure out and I learn that storytelling is a huge part of being a teacher and a trainer and all of that, and just communicating. And I don't know really any of the science of it at this point. This is back in like the 90s, and I was teaching college. And I just saw in my learners, students in college and trainees in workshops, and attendees at talks how well stories worked. And so I'm like, okay, this works. I'm going to keep doing it. And I just kept doing more and more stories. Finally, cut to I start to work at Arizona State University, and I end up stumbling into this PhD program. That's a whole nother story. And I've got to choose two fields of expertise to work on in the PhD. I drag in my master's for a minor field in adult learning, and I talk to my advisor, and he's a big risk guy. I'm a big risk guy. And I say, okay, risk is obvious. That's one. I want to focus on our perceptions. He's like, great, that's fantastic. What about your other field, John? And I'm like, I've always been, Andrew, his name is Andrew Maynard. I've always been fascinated by storytelling, and I'd love to study the science of it. He's like, done. I think that's perfect for you. Go for it. And so that's really how I got to where I am now, Noah.
Wow. That's quite the story. Where that's
Yeah,
going to that's going to come up a lot. I'm certain. And at the end of the day, if you think about what an expert witness does specifically, and what a trial is generally, it really is a series of stories that we tell and try and be the most convincing to a jury or whoever the fact finder is. It might be a judge in a bench trial. So how do expert witnesses harness some of that? What are some of the steps that we can take to better tell a tale that is relatable and conveys your expertise and your experience? Not necessarily what's the content, but what is the manner in which we should be delivering that content?
sure. No, I think it's a great question. There's so much in there. Real briefly, I mean, stories are wonderful sense and meaning making tools, right? They help us to relate, just as you said, and they do a bunch of other things. And an expert witness is supposed to help the court, which is, mostly the jury, like it's the judge, especially if it's a bench trial, and I've actually got one coming up.
Hmm.
And so there's nothing like a story that is so much easier to relate to. We're wired for stories. The scientists that study this all say the same thing. When we developed 100,000 years ago plus on the savannah, it wasn't about data. It was about storytelling even before we had language. So we're really wired for stories. We can relate to stories. So the first thing is, don't throw your data out the window, cliche, or euphemism, I guess. But instead, the pattern that I learned from the godfather of creative nonfiction, Lee Gutkind, he's the editor of the Journal of Creative Nonfiction, he's like, hey, John, it's real easy. Narrative, data, narrative, data, narrative. Keep going, but start with narrative to get people's attention, get to the what's at stake as soon as you can, and cut back and forth between the story, narrative, and the information, data. And as much as you can, weave that data into your narrative. And then I went to another workshop on sustainability, and there was a giant in the field, and he did a wonderful talk, and I raised my hand and I got called on. He's like, yes, the gentleman, yes, you right there, the young man. I'm not young by any stretch, but I'm like, oh, I'm looking around like, who the hell is he talking to, right? He's like, no, you. And I'm like, oh, great. And I said, love the talk. I didn't actually, you were talking about data, presenting your data, and I didn't hear you say anything about storytelling or narrative, and that's what I study. And he's like, oh my God, I can't believe I forgot that. Thank you so much for saying that. That's a great question. And he said, the wisdom these days, the consensus is no data without narrative, no narrative without data. So I really want to emphasize to people, this isn't either or. It's exactly as you said, Noah. How do we go about using stories to incorporate the data that is what we're supposed to do? And courts, like you said, and you know this, right? Given your background and all, is opening arguments and closing arguments are very often stories, right? And so I never, went to law school, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot more leeway for the attorney to say what they wish, not total carte blanche, but in the opening and especially the closing argument. But
Sure.
in between those bookends, it's all about the data. The jury will get bored, tired, distracted, and everything else if all they hear is a talking head talking about data. The human brain is not wired for data, and we cannot relate to statistics. There's a really good website that your listeners can go to called arithmeticofcompassion.org. And it's headed up by Paul Slovic. He's a giant in the field of risk. And it discusses that, statistics are not relatable, right? One person dies and it's a tragedy. 1 million people die and it's a statistic. It's an old quote attributed, I think, to Stalin originally, but whatever. A lot of these quotes, are identified with a person, but actually started much earlier.
Right.
And so these are all important that I want to make sure people really understand the basis of stories, how well they work. There is a science to them. Don't dismiss them because you think they're an anecdote. We could go down that tunnel or rabbit trail if you want.
Actually, yeah, that's a pretty good detour. What is the difference between a story and an anecdote?
So there's a story to what an anecdote is. So let's get back. So I'm going to get into this via persuasion science, right? Because you mentioned persuasion a couple of times, and it is part of what I study.
Sure.
Stories are incredibly persuasive with people. So they're a well-known tool for trying to persuade people. And most of us as expert witnesses are going to use, if we're telling a story, it's basically creative nonfiction, meaning it's a true story well told, as the Journal of Creative Nonfiction uses as their tagline. And so Charles Darwin, the scientist, said, preemptively address the counter argument. Now, if you're going to do that in court, you better be doing it only because your client, attorney, wants you to do it, right? I don't try to figure out the argument. I try to help my client better understand where I would come into this, and then it's up to them to decide how to construct that argument. But if you're trying to be persuasive in general, addressing the counter argument is important. Now, so when I do talks about storytelling, what's the counter argument that I get? One, they're too long. Okay, make them short and tell the person, here's a 3-minute story that nails my point. And two, everyone says, it's an anecdote. Anecdotes aren't data. I can't use anecdotes, et cetera, et cetera. We've all heard it tons of times, right? So I thought, well, what's an anecdote? So I looked it up. And you know who I consulted, Noah?
Who?
I consulted your namesake, Noah Webster.
Webster, of course.
Right? And so Noah Webster told me, well, the guy's been dead for a while, but he wrote a lot and it got, captured in dictionaries. And it said, an anecdote is a brief, humorous, biographical, relatable story, something like that, right? I don't have it in front of me. And I thought, brief and amusing and biographical, why those? And so I looked further, and there's the etymology. And it's like, okay, what's the root of this word? Now, this sounds like there's no interest in it. John, who cares what the Latin is of anecdote? What's the etymology of it, right? But wait till you hear it, right? Because it makes total sense. Anecdote comes from the Greek. So just like in that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding with Gus, everything comes from the Greek. And of course, that's a terrible Greek accent. And anecdote in Greece, in the Greek, is anecdota, which translates as unpublished. And I thought, oh, wait a minute. Why doesn't it translate as short story? right? Or amusing biographical something something. Why does anecdota translate as unpublished, right? There's more here to it. And so that's the story. So you got to go back to the 6th century in the Byzantine era, and the historian Procopius, who wrote about all sorts of stuff. So historians write about everything that they can, right? And he wrote about the Byzantine emperor Justinian and Justinian's wife and the court. And emperors do a lot of maybe ridiculous or dumb or whatever things. So Procopius wrote in some stuff that made fun of the emperor. Well, that's a really good way to literally lose your head, right? So emperors have a lot of power. So all of these writings, so he wrote history and history and history, okay? But he also wrote some of these, critical, amusing, things that made fun of the emperor, Justinian, right? And his wife. Oh my goodness. But they all remained unpublished because Procopius valued his life. And so, believe it or not, from this one episode, we get the word anecdote, because it's anecdota, non-published.
Right.
And it's amusing, biographical, brief, funny little vignettes. And because it means unpublished, and because you could literally lose your head, over the years, it became identified with you can't use these publicly. So all of a sudden, when science comes around, someone, who knows who, decides stories are anecdotes, anecdotes means unpublished, you could lose your head, therefore we're not going to use them anymore. And while you could make an argument scientifically that seems to make sense, from a human communication, relatability, understanding, encoding, learning, bonding, contextual, everything standpoint, it makes no sense whatsoever. Stories are the single most powerful form of communication that we're all hardwired for, and actually can, and this is backed up with empirical data, can cause biochemical reactions in our body.
It's interesting. This squares a lot with I had a jury consultant on who also spoke about things that juries can kind of just tune out, and when they pay more attention, and they pay more attention when you're telling a story, when you're making something relatable in a way that they can understand, that they can picture in their minds, or they can see in an exhibit. And so my question then becomes, how do we square the common attorney advice to expert witnesses, which is answer only the question that is asked? Because, of course, expert witnesses, while they opine, they do so through testimony where they're answering questions. They're not, so much giving a story the way that an attorney would during an opening statement or a closing statement. So how can an expert witness use anecdotes, use storytelling to enhance their testimony? And, I guess the corollary is, how do attorneys utilize this when they are coaching their expert witnesses?
Yeah, I think there's so much there, and I think it's perfect because you're right. I can't just go off on this random tangent of stories while I'm trying to answer a question. And absolutely right. Stick to the question. Don't answer more than that. If I want to then, do a counter question and get you to talk more about it, I'll do that. Right.
Sure.
So much of this, is the conversations really, for the most part, been very, very good about communicating to me and having it as a conversation. Here's the case I think I want to make. I need you to help me understand this better. What do you think of it? Where are the holes? And what have I missed? Right.
Sure.
And so there should, if things are working out well, I'll say, okay, I think that's good. Here's the trap. If I were working for the other side, here's where I would attack you. Okay. So you should know that. Right. And here's additional stuff that I think can also help, the what did I miss question, right? And then you get into, so John, if I ask you this, what are you going to say? And they always ask. They don't, no attorney has ever told me what to say. Never. Now, they've said, I'd love it if you could say something like, and then I say, I can say this, but I can't say that. And they're like, okay, that's fine, right? And so I might say, you know what? So Noah, let's pretend you were, my client, you're the attorney, right? An easy role for you to adopt. and you were to say, all right, if we want to focus on mold, right? And we want to illustrate, blah, 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 whatever it is, how are you going to address this, right? Because here's the problem statement, whatever it is. And in my background now, my brain is sorting through tons and tons of different examples, and the availability bias won't let me find all of them equally. Okay. And the ones that are going to come to mind are probably stories, because as Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and others have said, stories are sticky. They stick with us. So I'm probably going to come up with a story, and a story will be sticky for the jury as well, or the judge, right? And juries are, in a way, easier to influence because they're more likely to be subjective, whereas the judge is more likely to be objective and maybe not as prone to some of this stuff. I don't know. I'd love to do a study on that. And so
I'm sure they would like to think so anyway.
I'm sure they would. Absolutely. But you know what? That's confirmation bias, and that's the bias of self-interest or cognitive dissonance. Sorry, but I studied cognitive biases as part of risk. So I tell the attorney, client, I tell you, here's this story I think I would tell if you want me to. And I could get asked a question, and it could be that they ask me a question and this story fits in with that. Or it could be that my client says, you know what, whatever questions they ask you, just answer them. Don't even try for this stuff. If I think it's worth it, I'm going to ask you this one, right? I'm probably not going to ask you this other one, but I'm going to ask you this one. And I totally get that. And I respect it 100%. The attorney is absolutely in charge of figuring out the case. They know so much more about this than I do. I'm their advisor. I'm their helper. I'm trying to support the science of it, and I'm assisting my client in making whatever the case is that they want to make. Hopefully, it's a case that I feel is a just case, right?
Sure.
And so I can feel good about it and not just feel like I'm a hired gun, as that cliche goes, right? So it's this conversation, it's giving examples when you're just having the conversations in their office, on the phone, on a video chat, et cetera, and saying, does this work for you? Does that work for you? Or they might say, well, what about this? Or do you have anything about, I've done a lot of construction related cases. And so quickly we get into, the OSHA compliance directive on the multi-employer work site, right? Because a lot of times these are subcontractors, they're not employees that are involved. And so then that's a tough concept. It involves 4 employer types according to OSHA: controlling, creating, correcting, and exposing. And I can find it mildly interesting. The attorney will find it important for their case, but the jury is going to be bored out of their heads, out of their skulls. So then it could be that my client says, well, okay, Mr. Klane, could you please explain this? And I already know that when he says explain it, I'm going to use examples. And as examples, I'm going to use, creative nonfiction. I'm going to tell brief stories. I'm not going to go on and on. I'm not going to drone. I'm going to focus on the relevant topic and say, sure, I was on a job site and one contractor is digging the trench. They're creating the hazard. They're the creating employer. Another has an employee who is leaning over the trench. they're a subcontractor. Well, now that's the expose, et cetera, et cetera. And I could go on with it and all, and examples, but turning an example from what sounds like a case, which is kind of dry, into a story, or I like to call them, instead of case studies, case stories, right? To merge those two and use these tools of weaving my data into the story. So I would weave in the data of, and if the trench is deeper than 4 feet, it means this. And if it's deeper than 5 feet, it means this. And the contractor who's got the backhoe is piling the spoils, the dirt, and they're closer than the 2-foot setback that they're supposed to use. And so you could see, I just gave a data point, right? A bit of information, a 2-foot setback, but I wove, that's right? Not weaved, I wove. So I weaved it, I think it's weaved. I weaved it into the story form itself, instead of it being similar to my using a whole bunch of PowerPoint slides and bullet points. Instead, I'm standing up there and doing much more of a very, very brief TED Talk. And TED Talks, which are super popular, super relatable, wonderful things, are stories. They're never a text dump and bullet fest on a slide.
Well, one of the other things, of course, that expert witnesses have to do, and I'm wondering how this can be applied to it, is, of course, report writing. And of course, it's still written. It's while it's written, it's still a story. It's still a communication. So how can expert witnesses take this idea that stories are the best way to communicate something and get that into their expert report, which can be a dense technical document at times?
It really can. I've written some incredibly dense technical reports that I would probably cringe or yawn over myself. The first thing with the report is, what exactly does the client need? And a lot of times for me, the reports are very technical and but aren't that long sometimes, because it's the initial one, Jonathan, where, this is the initial thing that we're sending out. I forget what the technical term is, Noah, for it, your statement or whatever it is. And it's often, fewer than 10 pages.
Sure, that might be an initial report or an affidavit, depending on what you're doing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Both of those. Thank you so much. And so the first thing is, of course, what is it that they need, right? They probably don't need, a wonderful story. It's like, hey, great story, but that's not what we're trying to do here. So the first is, of course, what is it that they need? It's pure consulting. What is it that my client needs me to do? And then you get into a conversation of what should that say? And there's going to be stuff that gets, cut, right? I'm going to leave a lot on the table. And it could be, and it depends on what the client's needs are, and you could have, after an initial one or an affidavit, you can have much longer ones. And so then in that case, you may wish to propose to use, and I would suggest, examples that are themselves micro stories, and meaning very, very brief. The other, and that's a challenge for everyone, especially for me, I tend to, tell longer stories. Left to my own devices, I'll go long. I did just actually win a contest where I had to tell my research in under 3 minutes. So I guess I've got it in me when it's on the line, right? When something's at stake, I can actually do that. So the other that I really want to make sure I mention is the power of a metaphor. So instead of an analogy or a simile that uses the word like or as, which diminishes its power, a metaphor basically says, this is something else, or you are something else. And metaphors bring into mind stories, right? Metaphors are often in story form. And I started learning this from one of my counselors, right? So in therapy, talking through a tough time in my life. And she said, John, have you ever heard this saying? I'm sure you've heard it. a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I'm like, oh yeah, of course. And you would even mention images before, Noah. And so of course, yes,
Sure.
absolutely. And that's a whole nother, story about images and what works and et cetera, et cetera. But back to her, she said, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I'm like, oh yeah, definitely know that one, right? She said, have you ever heard that a metaphor is worth 1,000 pictures? And I was like, oh my God, no, I haven't. That's great. And then my analytical brain, of course, and I'm an industrial hygienist, certified industrial hygienist, so I'm a numbers guy and all, is like, wait a minute, what's the math on this? If a metaphor is worth 1,000 pictures and a picture is worth 1,000 words, 1,000 times 1,000, 10 to the 6th, right?
You've got it's a
So is it?
logarithmic amount of
Yeah, exactly.
information.
Exactly. And I'm doing it here, and people are like, wait, I think I know what he's saying. So, and it's silly, but it's fun. It's a math joke, if you're a math nerd, et cetera. So a metaphor now is worth like 1,000,000 words. That's crazy. And I'm not sure the math plays out, but you get the picture, right? And now the science of it is that metaphors can be incredibly powerful, like changing people's views between traditional sides of the political spectrum, right? Like even making a difference between, to the right or to the left, sort of stuff. And so metaphors, right? And we could easily go deep into that, can really work. Now, a metaphor is typically very brief. It's often a sentence, right? A rising tide lifts all sails. That's a metaphor, right? And so you can incorporate, if you're an expert witness and if your client likes it in the draft, right? And decide with them how they want it, because I got a good story on that. Every client is different, every attorney is different, right? You can work in metaphors that can really nail your point very well. And stories, context always matters. James G., professor of psycholinguistics, context always matters. You never want the other person to have to figure out the context because you've lost it. You want to, if you're making an argument, if you're trying to persuade, you want them to see it from your context. Stories are great contextual tools. So they work really well for solidifying the context so that the person listening, say they're a juror who doesn't have the technical expertise, understands the context that you're saying very well.
At the risk of being overly reductive, is that, actionable? Just that one thing, turn your similes into metaphors. In other words, instead of saying life is like a highway, say life is a highway, and that's more powerful, just as an example.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I haven't looked at research studies that actually studied that. However, I've looked at the studies that study too many times using the word study there. My editor hat on. John, try something else like research, right? Writing is writing. And, if you use the word understand 3 times in a sentence, that's not a good sentence. So, and we're talking about report writing, so I feel okay in dropping that in. But the research on metaphors is all on metaphors, and it says metaphors work for these reasons. And so, yeah, I'll go out on a limb and I'll sawed off behind me and say that metaphors are more powerful than analogies. If you have the option, don't use an analogy when you can use a metaphor, right? So don't bring a knife to a gunfight.
Right.
Sorry if people get offended by that. It's from The Untouchables. It's a great line. It's from the movie The Untouchables. It's said, I think, by Sean Connery's character, and I can't do a good Sean Connery impression, to save my life. But that, bringing up that, I wanted to do that because, yeah, I love the movie. I love Sean Connery. I think it's a powerful movie, right?
Sure.
But it brings to mind a story that if anyone has seen it, they can easily relate to it. And that's, again, the real power here.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, right? Is relate to whoever the target is of, whether it's a deposition or even in a non-court action, even in a an arbitration or other alternative dispute resolution types of things. Have you been involved as an expert in either arbitration or anything like that?
Yes. I don't think it was a bench trial. I think it was I don't remember the name of it, but it was the equivalent of arbitration, I guess. That's my non legal hat on, right? And it was two companies. I don't want to say what they were. Can I? I guess I can. It's an older case. I won't mention names. So it was two waste haulers, and one was accusing the other of poaching. That was the term, poaching their customers. And it was like, John, can you make an argument from an environmental health and safety standpoint that what this poacher is doing is creating unreasonable hazards to the general public? And I'm like, I can. It's not a hugely strong case, but I can. And so that was interesting. And it was an interesting case. And, as is very often the case, if you're an expert witness, get very much used to not knowing what the resolution was,
Hmm.
because a lot of my clients, it's sometimes I know for a variety of reasons, especially a client that I've worked with a lot or whatever, or hey, that worked out really well. But sometimes it's just, oh yeah, that case, yeah, we settled that months ago. Sorry, I didn't tell you. And that's fine. I did my job, I got paid. That's fine. But yeah, I use some. What I don't know, and again, would love to find out, is how well did things work? Now, I can tell you one that was court testimony, and I know how well it worked because I saw it in evidence and I heard it from my client, and they won the case. And so this is a 2-minute story that nails the point. So it was a mold case, so very, expert witness, sort of stuff, heavy data, hard to understand. I'm
Sure.
sitting there. I've collected a bunch of samples. Both sides have my report. I commented on the previous work that another consultant did, which I wasn't fond of their work. And I commented, so, that was part of my nature. And now the opposing counsel, who didn't like me very much, but it wasn't so much me, I'm in the way of him winning the case, is trying to get me to admit something bad about the data. And he's like, Mr. Klane, please look at sample number XYZ 23. And he hands me legal size paper with tiny print and no grid lines. It's obviously an Excel printout, but there's no grid lines. And I'm like, and there's gaps in the middle where it's all white space on the page.
Hmm.
And there's too many lines. I'm like, I'm sorry, there's no grid lines and I don't have a straight edge. I don't think you're talking about sample 23. I think you're talking about sample 22. And that was literal. I really think, and he was confused, right? Because his was the same.
Sure.
And he's like, well, here, use my legal pad. So he hands me his legal pad to use as a straight edge. And I go across and I'm like, yeah, no, it's not that one. It's sample 22, the one directly above it.
Hmm.
And so he looks at his and he's like, and it was a complaint. Well, now I don't have a straight edge. And without even thinking, I took the legal pad that he had just handed me and I, reached forward and I said, here, you can borrow mine, right? And the jury laughed. They thought that was hysterical, that here was this attorney complaining that now I don't have one. And so I'm like, oh, here, use mine, which is his back again. And they just found it humorous. And I heard them laugh. And it was the first time I was in court and I didn't think anything of it. People laugh at some of the stuff I say. Okay, that's fine. I'm trying to get something done here. I didn't recognize what had happened. Cut to the end of the day. We're all done. Who knows, right? They're coming back the next day, etc. And there's 3 people in the courtroom, me and my 2 clients, right? They're both for the same firm, the senior attorney and the junior attorney. No one else is in the room. And they're like, oh my God, John, that was fantastic. And I'm like, look, like what? Wait, what? They're like, you made the jury laugh. That's the golden ticket. That's fantastic. Oh my God. She even sent me a letter afterwards saying, hey, John, thank you so much. Great team effort. I think we had a very favorable outcome. We appreciate your work. And oh my God, for your first time in court, you made the jury laugh. That was, well, what is laughter? Laughter is a way of expressing how much we understand and empathize with something going on, which is probably a little bit of humorous pain, right? So I made it very relatable by turning this, little bit of back and forth into a little bit of an unintentional joke.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't tell a story, but I did something natural to me. And now I tell it as a story, and your listeners, will easily be able to relate to that sometimes that interplay can play a really key role in how we develop this relatability. I was a person to them. I wasn't a talking head. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't the data guy. I was just some guy who, did something funny and they could relate better to me. And that's, well, according to my client, that's the golden ticket. And saying that's the golden ticket, what does that bring to mind for you?
Of course, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
Right, exactly. So it's a metaphor and it's a reference, right, to an incredible, wonderful story that was first a book, then an original movie, then another movie, and now there's like a third movie coming out, something about that, right?
Right.
So these little touches that we can do that are really nothing about the data, right? But we can weave it in, can work, because it was really focused on, is this sample number 22 or sample number 23? Well, that's boring. Who cares, right? But that back and forth and then the metaphor from it, right, is just a wonderful way of making you as the expert witness much more relatable to the jury.
Something that I've often asked about with experts and then attorneys as well is the role of levity in court. And I don't think that I've ever heard it framed quite like that as a way to make what you're saying more relatable. And so in general, do you think that you would advocate for, obviously there's times where it would be wholly inappropriate, but in general, do you advocate for occasional levity in court?
Well, everything is about striking a balance. And I would say using things for a very specific purpose and to be more effective, never random, never gratuitous, and
Sure.
definitely not excessive as you said there, right? So an interesting story, I would say case, but I'd rather say story. Because if I say an interesting case, it's like, oh, yawn. But if I say an interesting story, oh, what's that? I was at Arizona State and I was teaching lab safety, biosafety, and fire safety. And I was doing 21 sessions every semester for biomedical engineering students. That's a lot. And I was using story form and I was using humor. And I wanted to know which was working better. And so, with the help of the professor, we ran a study because, of course, you have two sections. And so I delivered the exact same material, very technical, in two very different ways. For one section, I delivered it as funny little jokes, okay, but no story form whatsoever. Could not use story form. So a lot of, little dad jokes, et cetera, et cetera. The other, I did it in story form, but they could not be humorous stories, right? We had to separate them. And then I had one class where there was only one section. So for that one, I did humorous stories just so we could see what the merged case was.
Sure.
We gave them a quiz beforehand, right? So get a baseline. They hated that. We told them it didn't count towards their grade. They all bombed. Great, good. Because if they improve a lot, we can draw some conclusions, right? If they all did great and then did a little bit better, there's not enough of a statistical difference. I talked to a buddy. I asked him, how long do I have to wait to get rid of the priming effect? He said at least 2 weeks. So we waited 3 just to be safe. We gave him a follow-up test. They all did great. Not enough statistical difference between them because it's only been 3 weeks. They remember stuff. They're students. They're good. But with students, you've got the end of the semester. So 4 months later, right, we give them a follow-up test. Now we scramble everything. We scramble the questions, we scramble the answers for each question, everything's out of order, etc. You can't just remember it through rote learning. Care to guess which group did the best? Humor only, story only, or humorous stories?
The hybrid.
Naturally, right? If one is good and the other is also good, then the two together are going to be the best.
You would think.
You would think. That actually came in second. So
Huh.
now I'm going to put it back to you again. Now I'm forcing you to choose
Sure.
between the two. Which did better?
The story.
Yeah, exactly. And so stories are much more relatable and powerful and memorable. They get at our episodic memory as opposed to our, I think it's called semantic memory, which is more fact-based. And so we're very good at remembering contextual things in story form. Again, we're hardwired for this, right? And so yeah, a bit of a long ways to get to answer your question. Oh, and at the same time, unbeknownst to us and us unbeknownst to them, another research team at ASU was studying the use of humor in teaching. And what did they find? It makes people feel good, but it brings with it problems, right? Including that jokes for one person, other people aren't going to find funny. And so now you run the risk of telling a joke, and I don't encourage telling a joke, but saying something humorous, maybe, right?
Right.
That turns people off. And the second you've turned them off, you've lost them. Right? You start to lose, and they feel bad about you, and feeling drives risk decision making. And so that's just going to work terrible against you. So I'll purposely use stories, but I won't purposely use humor. I'll let it flow. I'll let it occur naturally. That's fine. I might be self-deprecating for the obvious reason, right? If I make fun of myself, I come off a little bit better, right? I don't make fun of someone else. That's a turnoff.
And for people who advocated for people I've interviewed who have advocated the use of humor, they've said the same thing, that if you do it, it should be self-deprecating and immediately understandable without a lot of cultural touchstones or popular media that not everybody might understand.
Exactly. Whereas the story, and so the emotionality. So what does everyone recommend? And this is backed up by the empiric data. If you want it to be effective, make it affective, make it emotional. We are moved by emotionally laden stories about a single person, a single victim, because that's who we are. We care about a person one-on-one. And so there's a researcher, Dr. Paul Zak, Z-A-K. Listeners can look him up. Great researcher. Studied oxytocin and discovered that we secrete oxytocin at the peak or climax of a well-told, emotionally laden story, and other hormones as well at other parts within the 5 to 6 part story structure that people are probably very familiar with.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so lots of science, lots of great research on this topic. And I really want to highlight not just the stories, which, story form and story power, Noah, but also this need to make sure you really know when you first introduced this, hey, John, we want to, do this podcast with you, and report writing and storytelling and communication and all of that. I'm like, oh, I've got to tell them about this one thing. First question with an attorney client, how do you want me to communicate? What can I write? What can't I write down? What can I put in an email? What can't I? What's a draft? And it differs. Don't just tell me it's a state or federal case, and it's in this state. You tell me what you want me to do, especially what you don't want me to do. And so I had one client where it's like, okay, don't send me anything. Or pick up the phone and call me And okay, we need to write this. You need to write this report. We'd like to comment on it. I can't see any drafts. Can you bring it on your laptop to my office? We'll hook it up. We'll connect it to the big screen and I'll look at it, but it's always going to be on your device. You're always the one typing it. And I literally did that for one of my clients because that was what they needed me to do because of the way, the court system in this case or whatever worked.
Discovery rules. Yeah.
Discovery rules. Thank you so much. Yeah. Technical words don't come to me when they need to, right? And see, there's the drop in the self-deprecating humor, right?
Right.
But it's true. And so that's what I did for that client. And that's what that client needed me to do. One more, and this one's a minute. This was not traditional, someone's being sued. This was an in-house attorney, and they were doing their own self-evaluation. And so I did a very comprehensive industrial hygiene audit of everything about this very large utility company. And they said, tell us where we comply, tell us where there are consensus standards, and we could do better. So I write the draft, attorney-client privilege, as directed, send it to the attorney, right, not to the IH there, the industrial hygienist. And I get a reply back, actually picks up the phone, of course, not in writing. Hey, John, loved it. I think all the technical details are great. I got one question about one word, just one word. And you go, one word, what the hell's the word going to be? Oh my God, right? It's got to be something technical. It's got to be, right? Nope, not. It's like, John, on the regulatory matters where we're out of compliance, totally get that. We must. Yep. Regs are shall. On the consensus standards and the best practices, you use the word should. Very standard, very standard. What I want to know, John, is how do you feel about, instead of using the word should, using the word can? And, I had to think about it. How do I feel about that? Well, this isn't the due diligence where I'm being hired to evaluate a third party. This is strictly in-house for their own use. So there's no complication. There's no conflict of interest there. This is for their use and their use only. And I totally get it. You should do something implies that for whatever reason, I am telling you, this is something that I feel I got to think of a synonym for should, right? That you ought to be doing.
Or ought, yeah.
Yeah, ought to be doing, right? Whereas can is more like, if we want to, we can, we may, we might. It's up to us. It's not compelled by an external source, even in a suggested way, right?
Sure.
And so, care to guess what I ended up saying, whether I could or couldn't say can?
I would say couldn't, because they don't mean the same thing.
Yeah, they don't mean the same thing. So I actually agreed. I said, it took me a while. I said, you know what? In this case, specifically because, and I told him, because you're the in-house and this isn't entirely voluntary on your part, there is no external whatsoever driving this. Yes, I believe I can substitute the word can for the word should. And, because there's always going to be exceptions. And I think the most important thing for a person to be able to do is reframe their perspective on something that they've already considered. It's phenomenally challenging, but if you can have the ability to reframe how you think about something, you can be very effective, very helpful, and very convincing, because it's obvious you haven't locked in to something, that you're actually listening to the other person and trying to adopt their perspective. And perspective taking is just a phenomenally challenging thing to be able to do.
Do you think that experts should be monitoring the jury reactions to the things that they're saying and the exhibits they're presenting, and modify on the fly the manner in which they are presenting their expertise or their opinions?
Yeah, I was with you until you said monitoring their expert witness. It's really hard to watch someone's reactions and figure out how are they reacting when you're still trying to keep track of what you're saying. And
Sure.
the opposing counsel is trying to have you feel like it's a conversation and start talking instead of just answering questions. It's a lot to keep track of.
Of
And
course.
so, yeah. And so I think it's important to be able to look around and not stare at the jury. That's off-putting. But to look over and to glance and to make points, always with a purpose, not random, like your head is tracking back and forth like you're a robot or
Sure.
something, but to do it in a way that's natural, but also expressive and lets people see you as a person. You're not perfect, you're not an actor, you're trying to be natural and expressive. And so you look at the person asking you, maybe you look over at the judge, depending on what's going on. Maybe not, because they're often sort of behind your shoulder. You look over at the jury occasionally, you try to do stuff. And so, yeah, there's been a few times where the attorney has said, you know what, I want you to actually observe, the judge. The judge isn't giving anything away. Don't worry. I want you to focus on the witness, John, and I want you to focus especially on the jury and how is the jury reacting to the witness and what can you tell me about that afterwards we can at lunch or at the end of the day. And so I've done that several times and it's really fascinating. I'd love to get back into that, mostly because now getting the PhD, I study cognitive biases and cognition and decision making and so many of those aspects that I really feel like I could probably be a bit of a jury consultant slash storytelling coach for attorneys and really help them nail the message in ways that really work well. And that, who knows, maybe that'll be something that I'll get into more. So I do think that observing can be very, very helpful. In one of my very first ones, I observed an engineer who was a colleague, brilliant, super nice guy, but he was struggling in his testimony. And it was obvious that he was uncomfortable having to admit what he was saying. And not that he had done anything wrong, but I could see the way his body was reacting, the body language, and his voice was breaking up at times. And I could see the reaction in the jury to that. And that taught me that don't get uncomfortable and, tell the truth. He was telling the truth. And don't worry about awkwardness. It's only going to make matters worse. And so these observations can help yourself. So that's a recommendation and can help your client.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, do you have any other last advice that you'd like to give expert witnesses, and in particular, newer expert witnesses?
Yeah. Enjoy it. It's not always enjoyable. A buddy of mine described being an expert witness as, you go in and you feel like you know everything and you come out and you feel like you're not even sure who you are and your brain is like Swiss cheese metaphor. Your brain is Swiss cheese with a bunch of holes in it, right? So it is a great way to make a living if you can. And it's 100% about trying to be the best consultant that you can to your client, which is only partly about your data and the science, but a lot of it is in how effective a communicator you are. And the best way to communicate, depending upon the context, the most powerful is always going to be to try to weave your data into some type of meaningful narrative that works for your client's case. There you go.
Sage advice. Mr. Klane, thank you so much for joining me here today.
You're welcome, Noah. This was an incredible pleasure. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to you and to the Roundtable for reaching out. I'm really glad and I hope people get a lot out of it. And I look forward to hearing.
Absolutely. And thank you to our listeners for joining me here for another discussion at the Roundtable. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.